Hello, everybody. Welcome to Teacher Rants and Red Pill Readings, episode number 1. And what I'd like to do today is sort of introduce what my thoughts are on this show and sort of maybe explain what my political philosophy is as my background as a teacher at a small school and political thinker and anarchist slash minarchist slash, I guess, Jeffersonian libertarian, I guess, as my ideas evolve. And what I want to talk about today is how difficult it is teaching civics or government or U.S. history, which is my background, in today's environment where we're supposed to instill a belief in civic virtue and the efficacy of the system, when in fact, I don't think the system works anymore. I think it's failed, it's decrepit, it's rotten. And how we do that while maintaining a belief in teaching and that teaching works and that young people will grow up wanting to be a part of the system, it's a really challenging act to manage. And so what I want to do today is sort of tie in the recent events with the contentious election, connecting that to what's going on in my classroom without mentioning the specifics of where I'm currently teaching. So what I've noticed is that there is this tendency, this overwhelming tendency to focus on all things national. And look around you, it's obvious whether it's the general election, which of course we call the presidential election because we're fixated on fawning over these figures, whether it's a general election or whether it's what's going on at the national level in politics in Washington, D.C., the Beltway, the hub of the empire. And from adults to young people, everybody does it. The media encourages it, and that is mainstream media along with social media. So all avenues are apt to focus more on the big, the broad, the highly visible. And what I realized is that in doing that, as many have said before me, so this is certainly not original, in doing that, we are taking away from what the country was founded to be, and that is a federal republic. And I want to go ahead and give a tip of the hat here to the political thinker that has shaped me the most in the last 10 years. That's Brian McClanahan. So I do want to mention his podcast. It's been very influential. And as I've kind of grown into my political philosophy and sort of that's taken root, I really owe a lot to what he's mentioned because he focuses primarily on primary sources. So on any given day, when you listen to his show, he'll do current events, but really he said from day one, he was basing it in history. And there's a certain beauty in connecting what's going on now with past events. So with history, because history is always only ever how we remember things. And so it is really incumbent upon us to try to connect current events to what's happened in the past. And if it doesn't repeat, then it certainly echoes. And so there's a certain resonance there. And so with the recent election and this tension, I'm reminded of a certain time in history when there were political thinkers, and obviously they're big, big names, you'll know them, who were trying to focus on the importance of local, thinking small, thinking in the immediate environment. And it's the antithesis of that that's gotten us into so much trouble. And by trouble, of course, I just mean the vitriolic nature of what goes for discourse today. It's awful, it's nasty, it's negative. You all know it, everybody sees it. And so there were some conversations in 1798 I want to point to, and we'll call this the reading portion of today. I want to mention a reading. And for me, it was kind of a red pill, and I'll sort of go over what that means for those of you that are not well versed in the Matrix and its impact upon culture the last 20, 30 years. But in 1798, what's going on essentially is that John Adams' administration, his one term, their Congress had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were greatly limiting of free speech, and of course Adams' intention and the Federalists' intention primarily, and of course he's complicit, was to suppress opposition. The Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonians were to be shut up, they were to be cast out, they were to be quieted, and of course there's many reasons for that I won't go into as far as maybe Adams' rationale, but the long and short of this is that there was pushback, and the pushback came in the form of what Jefferson, what we attribute to Jefferson as nullification, and the idea that states, in bucking what they deemed to be unconstitutional laws, had the ability to nullify or declare those laws null and void. So a state could look at a federal law and study it, examine it, and then deem it to be unconstitutional. And then after that, they would decide to simply not enforce that within the state's borders. And so you have a couple of conversations I thought were really interesting. At one point, you have Jefferson communicating with John Taylor of Caroline, and what's going on is that you have these Jeffersonian Republicans, those two, the Republicans, talking about what to do in this environment. So here they are in 1798. John Adams is finishing out his one term. At this point, Jefferson and Adams are essentially estranged. They're not really friends at this point, given that Adams is the key Federalist in Hamilton's shadow. But Jefferson is really becoming the voice of the opposition. Of course, he'll blossom into that as a leader of his party eventually within the next couple of years. And so what happens is, in this letter, John Taylor and Jefferson are sort of at odds as to what to do when a federal government becomes tyrannical. And as I go through this briefly, I want you to consider sort of the environment we're in and the natural inclination, and this isn't meant to be a partisan jab, the natural inclination, regardless of which party's in power, is to push back and then foist your own party's beliefs on the other group, the enemy, and then sort of make it a national policy. So there's this really sort of, unsettling tendency to try to make everything national in that sense. My policies, your policies, it's all this big fight over national spoils. But in 1798, what Jefferson and Taylor were talking about was, how do you actually address this in a sensible way? And Jefferson's belief espoused in this particular, these are letters that they're writing back and forth, these prominent Virginians. They're letters that they're discussing what to do, and Jefferson's opinion is that, well, when the federal government becomes so overbearing and so tyrannical and so despotic, in 1798, his thinking is that, well, let it ride out, and it'll be so egregious that eventually there will have to be a correction of some sort. So when people see how bad it is, that will then elicit the pushback. I guess today we might say, well, yeah, people get so sick of policies over the course of 2 terms, presidents, for example, maybe Bush and Obama, who are birds of a feather in many ways, or were birds of a feather, that the pushback then comes in the person of, at least in this case, Trump winning in 2016. And so I won't mention the current election because it's maybe a separate topic, but related nonetheless. But Jefferson's opinion during this little back and forth is that, well, we're going to let it ride out, and secession is not wise, so we're not going to talk about that. But Taylor's response is, well, the right reaction in this case is to take the bull by the horns and to essentially push the issue. And so then we get into issues like secession and nullification. And really what Taylor is espousing here is a pretty radical notion that what a state can do is essentially go against federal law or fail to or choose to not enforce federal law. And it's a pretty radical notion, and we've seen it play out the last few years. We've heard mention of California doing it. Texas is, I feel like every 20 or 30 years, Texas is in the news for at least talking about such things, depending on who's the state's executive. And so what I think people don't realize, though, with our modern sensibilities, is that these ideas, whether it's nullification or talk of secession, they're pretty well rooted in American history and not just in the South. So when Taylor and Jefferson had this conversation in 1798, of course it's going to play out that year with Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions. What they're doing is they're talking about, in a federal republic, which our country is. It's not a nation. It's not top-down government. In a federal republic where the states maintain most of the power, in fact, they have the ability to interpret federal law as they see fit. And regardless of how this conversation played out, and of course Taylor being the more radical of those two people talking, Jefferson's consistency throughout his political career, and this is not to say anything about his moral shortcomings or even his time in office as president, where the second term is certainly a letdown. Jefferson is the most consistent spokesperson for American federalism. And in some ways, that's American conservatism. Because what he's saying is that it's always within the state's power, a state's power, to look at federal laws. And we struggle with this because we're looking from a partisan perspective. And this is our modern background, right? But Jefferson says it's always within states' powers to examine these laws, and if necessary, you can decide to nullify those laws, meaning you can declare it null and void. Now, there's a background to that, which is a state compact fact, as Dr. McClanahan has mentioned several times, that we'll discuss at some point. But states are allowed to do this according to the way Jefferson reads the Constitution, given that it was a compact between states. And essentially that language is used in the document itself. And what it reminded me of is that with all this fixation upon the national political scene, whether it's Congress or the presidency, and the way the media sort of interprets that for us, and they sort of stoke the flames, and they stir the pot, and they encourage these divisions. And no doubt they encourage it because it gets views, likes, etc. That in reality, the way the government's designed, states can determine to nullify and possibly secede from the Union. Now, I will say Jefferson throughout his career thought that secession was not wise. And he's pretty consistent in saying that. And so in his own Kentucky resolutions written in 1798, the so-called Spirit of 98 or the Principles of 98, where Jefferson really first espouses this, and of course later South Carolinians kind of pick up on this, etc. My point is that Jefferson will say, well, states can nullify, and nullification or refusal to enforce these laws is a way to preempt or cut off secession. And I want you to think about how contentious American politics has become. It's always been nasty to a degree, and certainly we can make the argument that civil wars are, well, if we call it a civil war, but wars between our states seem imminent. They always seem closer, and they seem nastier. And of course, every election is the most important election. But I think that we forget that it's probably better in the long run if this came about that states could separate peacefully rather than bash each other over the head or, God forbid, actually go to war. And so the reading I want to recommend today is Jefferson's Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. And as I mentioned before, this essentially is Jefferson's reaction to the John Adams administration's passage of the Alien and Sedition laws, which were an egregious violation of the First Amendment, no doubt about it. I think Adams was, in a way, kind of reluctant in signing off on those. It was the Federalist Congress that decided to push this forward, although Adams probably viewed the behavior of Republicans as unseemly and dangerous, which, given the context, might have been fair to say. But when Jefferson wrote this for Kentucky, what he was saying, that just to say this one more time, is that according to his reading of the Constitution, which he was not present for the crafting of, but his reading of it was that states could in fact decide to not enforce unconstitutional federal laws. In this case, the Alien and Sedition laws clearly were despised throughout the land. Adams wasn't particularly draconian, I don't think, in enforcing them, like, say, Woodrow Wilson would be later in the Espionage and Sedition laws of 1917, 1918. But nonetheless, people were put in jail, they were fined, and to really show how repudiated these were, Jefferson obviously won in 1800, and really what you'll have for the better part of 45, 50, maybe even 60 years is a Jeffersonian thinking country, as far as a belief in both North and South that states could decide to enforce laws if they chose, but not enforce them also if they chose. And so secession was always on the table. And that's where Lincoln later, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, when Lincoln takes office, right, with the culmination of what had happened in the really volatile 1850s, when Lincoln decides that secession is illegal, he's making that up, because up to that point, it had never really been viewed as illegal. Both North and South, you'll find plenty of support for it, and it wasn't widespread, and it wasn't that like people were promoting it, but it was viewed as unwise, right, because there was this attempt to maintain some kind of union, which was a federal republic. And so I want to wrap up in saying that, and I'm with the first reading I want to recommend to you. It's such a beautiful, it's a beautiful rendering of what will become known as nullification, but it is a really great vision for federalism. And it is, for Jefferson, I think, if you want to really read Thomas Jefferson and understand what he was all about, and obviously he was a very complex person, a brilliant thinker, and a very, he's the sort of second in line of indispensable Americans. He's so important to American history, for better or for worse, because of what he represented. But it really is his best explanation of what American federalism is. And we'll explore these ideas later, and we'll talk about my many adventures in a classroom, kind of trying to measure this and trying to connect this with just teaching regular day-to-day classes in U.S. history. And it's challenging because I would like my students to, in a way, become radical. Radical in the sense that they truly believe in a federal republic, not a nation that's going to hate each other for having different beliefs or having different local political cultures. So we'll see you next time.